In 1866, a New Hampshire bridge builder named James Tasker drove the last wooden peg into a covered bridge spanning the Connecticut River. He was 60 years old. He had no formal engineering training. He had never attended a university, never studied structural mechanics, never read a textbook on load distribution. He had learned his trade the way most American builders learned theirs, by watching, by helping, by failing, and by doing it again until the bridge held. The bridge he built that year was 449 feet long, the longest wooden-covered bridge in the United States of America. That bridge is still there. You can drive a pickup truck across it today. There are roughly 700 wooden-covered bridges still standing in America right now. The oldest of them were built before the Civil War. Some of them still carry daily vehicle traffic. Farmers drive tractors across them. School buses cross them every morning. And most of these bridges were built by men like Tasker, self-taught carpenters and farmer builders who never wrote down a single calculation. They had no steel, no concrete, no power tools of any kind. They used wooden pegs, hand-cut mortise and tenon joints, and a roof to keep the rain off the timbers. This is how they built bridges that have outlasted everyone who ever built them. To understand why anyone would bother putting a roof on a bridge, you need to understand what happens to wood when you leave it outside. An uncovered wooden bridge, open to the sky, begins dying the moment you finish building it. Rain soaks into the end grain of every timber. Snow sits on the deck and melts into the joints. The summer sun bakes the surface and opens cracks along the grain, and those cracks let in more moisture the next time it rains. Fungus colonizes the heartwood. Carpenter ants bore into the softened fibers. The structural members weaken from the inside, where you cannot see the damage until it is too late. In 15 years, sometimes less, an uncovered wooden bridge is rotting from the inside out. The timbers sag. The joints pull apart. The deck becomes unsafe for anything heavier than a man on foot. And then one spring flood, one surge of ice and snowmelt, finishes the job. The whole thing washes downstream in pieces, and the town is back to fording the river on horseback. This was the fundamental problem of American bridge building in the late 1700s and early 1800s. America had rivers everywhere, thousands of them, cutting across every road, every trade route, every path between farm and market. And America had timber everywhere. Millions of acres of virgin white pine, hemlock, spruce, and oak that could be felled, squared, and jointed into bridge timbers. The materials were abundant. The need was desperate. But you could not keep a wooden bridge standing for more than a single generation. Every 15 to 20 years, every wooden bridge in the country needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Towns went bankrupt doing it. Farmers lost access to markets when bridges failed midwinter and could not be repaired until spring. People drowned at river fords that existed only because the bridge upstream had rotted away and collapsed 3 years earlier. The solution was so simple it seems almost embarrassing in hindsight. Put a roof on it. Cover the wooden trusses with a roof and siding, the same way you would cover a barn or a meeting house. Keep the rain off the structural timbers. Keep the snow off the joints. Let air circulate through the interior so that moisture never accumulates. A covered wooden bridge, properly maintained, does not rot in 15 years. It lasts 50 years. It lasts 100 years. Some of them, as we now know with certainty, last more than 160 years. The roof is not decoration. The roof is not tradition. The roof is the engineering. And yet, for all its simplicity, the covered bridge required something more than a roof to work. It required a truss. If you enjoy learning about the people who built this country with their hands, and you do not want to miss what comes next in this story, subscribe to this channel right now. We tell stories like this every single week. A truss is a framework of triangles. Triangles are the only geometric shape that cannot be deformed under load without breaking one of its members. A square can be pushed sideways into a parallelogram. A rectangle can be racked flat, but a triangle holds its shape. Push on any corner, and the forces distribute through all three sides. Every bridge truss in history, from the timber bridges of ancient Rome to the steel highway spans of the 20th century, is built on this one principle. The question for early American bridge builders was not whether to use triangles. The question was how to arrange those triangles using nothing but wood, and how to connect them at the joints without iron. In 1820, a Connecticut architect named Ethel Town answered that question with an invention that reshaped how America crossed its rivers. Town was not a bridge builder by trade. He was an architect, best known in New England for designing churches and public buildings in the Federal style. He had designed the Center Church on the New Haven Green and Trinity Church beside it, both still standing. But he was also a relentless tinkerer, and the problem of wooden bridges had fascinated him for years. His solution was the Town lattice truss. Instead of using massive timbers arranged in complex geometric patterns that required skilled engineering to design and assemble, Town proposed a lattice of relatively small wooden planks. Each plank was about 3 inches thick and 10 to 12 inches wide. They were arranged diagonally and overlapping in a crisscross pattern, like a garden fence tilted at an angle. If you have ever stepped inside a covered bridge and looked at the walls, you have almost certainly seen the Town lattice. It looks like a wall of wooden X shapes, stretching from the deck to the roofline, running the entire length of the bridge. The genius of Town's design was not just structural, it was economic and democratic. The Town lattice truss required no large timbers, no massive beams that needed teams of oxen to drag from the forest, no iron bolts, no iron plates, no iron of any kind. Every member was a plank that an ordinary water-powered sawmill could produce in minutes. Every joint was secured with wooden pegs, called tree nails, that any competent carpenter could cut from a billet of white oak and drive with a mallet. You did not need a trained engineer to build a Town lattice bridge. You did not need specialized equipment. You needed a crew of farmers with hand tools, a supply of sawn lumber from the nearest mill, and one man who had built a bridge before and understood the sequence. Town patented the design on January 28, 1820, and charged a licensing fee that was both modest and ruthless. $1 per foot for anyone who wanted to build a bridge using his lattice pattern. $2 per foot if he caught you building one without paying first. It was, by the standards of the 1820s, an elegant business model. And it worked spectacularly. Within 20 years of the patent filing, Town lattice truss bridges were being built in virtually every state east of the Mississippi River. Farmers pooled their money at town meetings, bought lumber from the local mill, hired a carpenter who had helped raise a bridge in the neighboring county, and put up a covered bridge the same way they raised a barn, with manpower, hand tools, and collective will. The Town lattice spread across America faster than the railroad. It was the most widely built bridge truss in American history, and its descendants are still standing in 23 states. But Town was not the only man trying to solve the wooden bridge problem. A generation before the lattice patent, a New York bridge engineer named Theodore Burr had developed his own approach to long-span wooden bridges. Burr's innovation was to combine a traditional arch with a king-post truss, creating a hybrid structure that became known as the Burr arch truss. The arch, built from laminated timber planks bent and bolted together, carried the primary load in compression, the way any arch has carried loads since Roman aqueducts. The truss, built above and around the arch, stiffened the entire structure and prevented the arch from flattening under uneven or concentrated weight. The result was a bridge design that could span enormous distances in wood. Burr himself built a bridge over the Hudson River at Waterford, New York, that stretched more than 800 feet, one of the longest wooden bridges in the world at the time. The Burr arch truss was heavier than Town's lattice. It required larger timbers, more skilled layout work, and greater precision in the arch construction. but it was enormously strong, and it was beautiful. Some of the longest and most graceful covered bridges in America were built using the Burr arch, particularly in Pennsylvania, where it became the dominant bridge design for nearly a century. Theodore Burr did not live to see most of them. He died in 1822, largely forgotten, having spent his later years in poverty. He never patented his arch truss design. He never collected a licensing fee. He never profited from the hundreds of bridges built using his principles. He built bridges, and then he disappeared from the historical record. The truss that bears his name outlived him by 2 full centuries, and it will likely outlive the century we are in now. This is the recurring pattern of American covered bridge history. The builders are mostly anonymous. The bridges remain. The wood remembers what the records forgot. Consider the men who actually raised these structures. Not the designers and patent holders, but the crews who stood on the riverbanks in the cold and put the timbers together with their hands. Most covered bridges were built by local labor, organized the same way any community project was organized in rural America. A town would vote at a meeting to build a bridge. They would appropriate the funds, sometimes from taxes, sometimes from tolls on an existing ferry crossing. They would hire a master builder, usually a man who had helped construct a bridge somewhere else and understood the critical sequence of operations. And then the work began. The foundation came first, always. Stone abutments on each bank, and sometimes 1 or 2 stone piers standing in the river itself. The abutments were built from local fieldstone or quarried granite, each stone weighing anywhere from 50 to 500 pounds, laid up in courses and set in lime mortar, or sometimes stacked dry. The abutments had to be massive enough to resist the lateral thrust of the trusses pushing outward, and tall enough to keep the bridge deck well above flood stage. Building them meant working in the river. In New England, that often meant working in water cold enough to numb your legs in 10 minutes. Men stood waist deep in the current, setting stones by hand, leveling each course with a spirit level, packing the joints with smaller stones and gravel. There were no cofferdams on most of these projects, no mechanical pumps, no rubber waders. You worked wet, and you worked cold, and you kept working until the abutment was finished, because the bridge had to be completed before winter shut everything down. Once the abutments were up and the mortar had cured, the trusses were assembled on the riverbank. The town lattice was typically built flat on the ground, like a fence laid on its side. Carpenters laid out the bottom cord first, a long horizontal timber running the full planned length of the bridge. Then they began attaching the diagonal lattice members, overlapping them in the X pattern, drilling holes at every intersection with a hand-cranked auger, and driving tree nails through each joint. A tree nail is a wooden peg, usually turned or whittled from white oak or black locust, about 1 inch in diameter and 8 to 12 inches long. You sharpened one end to a gentle taper, aligned the drilled holes in the overlapping planks, and drove the peg through with a wooden mallet. No glue, no nails. No metal fastener of any kind in the original trusses, just wood against wood, held together by friction and geometry. Here is something about tree nails that the builders understood intuitively, and that modern engineers have confirmed only recently. A wooden peg driven into a hole bored through green or semi-seasoned timber swells as it absorbs moisture from the surrounding wood. As it swells, it expands against the walls of the hole, creating a mechanical lock that tightens over time. This is the opposite of what happens with a metal bolt. A bolt, heated by the sun and cooled by the night, expands and contracts at a different rate than the surrounding timber, slowly loosening its grip over months and years until someone has to come back and retighten it. A tree nail gets tighter on its own. The builders selected hardwood pegs for softwood trusses deliberately because the differential swelling of the two species created a permanent, self-tightening joint that required no maintenance and no adjustment. They knew this not from laboratory testing, but from 100 years of building barns, farmhouses, and sailing ships along the New England coast. The same joinery that held a timber-frame Cape Cod house together held a covered bridge together. The technology was vernacular. It was inherited. It lived in the hands of the men who used it, and it died when those men died, until someone opened the bridge and studied the joints. Once both trusses were assembled flat on the ground, the crew raised them to vertical. On a short bridge, this could be done with ropes and the coordinated muscle of 20 or 30 men pulling together. On a longer span, they used false work, temporary wooden scaffolding erected in the riverbed on stone footings. The false work supported the trusses at regular intervals while the crew raised them, plumbed them with a spirit level, and bolted the heavy crossbeams into place connecting the two trusses at top and bottom. Those crossbeams transformed two flat panels into a rigid three-dimensional box, a tunnel of wood strong enough to carry anything the road could send across it. Then the roof went on. Rafters, purlins, a ridge beam, and wooden shingles or sawn boards. The same roof framing you would find on any New England building of that era. The siding came after the roof, boards nailed horizontally to the outside faces of the trusses, with deliberate gaps left near the roof line to allow ventilation. Air had to circulate through the interior at all times to keep moisture from condensing on the timber surfaces. A sealed bridge would actually rot faster than a ventilated one. The builders understood this the same way they understood barn ventilation. A dairy barn, sealed tight, sweats on the inside walls and rots from the ceiling down. The same physics applied to bridges. Last came the deck. Heavy planks, typically 3 to 4 inches thick, laid across the floor beams. Some builders used a double-layer deck, one layer of planks running lengthwise for structural strength, and a wearing surface running crosswise on top for traction and durability. The deck was the most frequently replaced part of any covered bridge because it absorbed the direct impact of iron-shod hooves, iron-rimmed wagon wheels, and eventually rubber truck tires grinding across the wood grain with every crossing. But the deck could be replaced easily without touching the trusses above it, and the trusses, shielded from rain by the roof and from wind-driven moisture by the siding, could stand indefinitely. This was the quiet genius of the covered bridge. The sacrificial parts were cheap and simple to replace. The structural parts were permanent. James Tasker understood all of this down to his bones. When he built the Cornish-Windsor covered bridge in 1866, spanning the Connecticut River between Cornish, New Hampshire, and Windsor, Vermont, he used 3 town lattice trusses, arranged side by side, to create a structure wide enough for 2 full lanes of opposing traffic. The bridge rested on 2 stone piers, standing in the river, and massive stone abutments on each bank, creating 3 spans totaling 449 feet. Tasker was 60 years old when the work began. He had been building covered bridges across New Hampshire for decades. He worked from no blueprint. He employed no college-trained engineer. He supervised a crew of local carpenters, selected the timber personally from local mills, and directed the entire construction sequence from foundation stone to ridge pole. I have walked across the Cornish-Windsor. I have stood inside that bridge and looked up at the lattice trusses that Tasker's crew assembled 160 years ago. The tree nails are still seated. The lattice members are still tight against each other. The floor creaks under your feet, a deep groaning sound that vibrates up through your boots. And it is the same sound that horse-drawn wagons made crossing that deck in 1867. The bridge has been repaired and partially rebuilt over the decades. New deck planks, new siding, new roofing above. But the bones are Tasker's. The trusses are his. The engineering belongs to a 60-year-old man with no degree and a lifetime of watching wood. And it still works. 2,000 miles to the west, in the Sierra Nevada foothills of California, a carpenter named David Wood was solving a different version of the same problem under very different conditions. In 1862, Wood built the Bridgeport covered bridge over the South Yuba River, near the gold mining town of French Corral. The bridge was 233 feet long, and it was a single span. No piers standing in the river, no intermediate supports of any kind. Two massive howe trusses, one on each side, carrying the entire weight of the bridge and everything on it, from one rock bank to the other, across 233 feet of empty air above a mountain river. A single span of that length in wood is an act of calculated defiance against gravity. The dead load of the bridge itself, the weight of every timber and plank and peg, creates a constant downward force at the center of the span that wants to pull the whole structure into the water. Add a loaded ore wagon crossing at mid-span, and the forces multiply. The howe truss handles these forces through a specific division of labor. The diagonal members, made of heavy timber, handle compression, pushing force. The vertical members, made of iron rods with threaded ends, handle tension, pulling force. This was one of the few truss designs of the era that deliberately combined wood and metal, using each material for what it did best. David Wood understood these forces well enough to build a single span that has now survived 163 years of Sierra Nevada winters, spring floods swollen with snowmelt from 10,000-foot peaks, and the occasional earthquake rolling through the California foothills. The Bridgeport covered bridge is the longest single-span wooden covered bridge in the world. It is still standing. You can walk through it on a January afternoon and see the original timbers squared with a broadaxe, joined with the precision of a man who knew exactly what each timber needed to do. David Wood's timbers, cut from trees that were seedlings when Thomas Jefferson was alive. But not every bridge survived, and the ones that fell tell us just as much as the ones that remain. If you have stayed with this story this far, you already understand what made these structures extraordinary. Subscribe now so you do not miss the rest of this, or the ones we are building next. The greatest single catastrophe in American covered bridge history struck Vermont in October of 1869. A series of massive rainstorms hit the Green Mountains over several days, dumping water on slopes already saturated from a wet autumn. Rivers that normally ran shallow and clear became walls of brown water 8 and 10 feet above their banks, carrying uprooted trees, boulders, fence rails, dead livestock, and everything else the current could rip loose. The floods came fast. They came everywhere. And the bridges took the worst of it. In a matter of days, Vermont lost more than 200 covered bridges. 200 structures wiped from the map. Some bridges were lifted whole off their abutments and carried downstream like enormous wooden barges, spinning slowly in the current until they struck a ledge or another bridge and broke apart. Some had their stone abutments scoured out from beneath by the force of the water cutting through the foundation gravel, causing the abutment to shift and the bridge to drop into the flood. Some were destroyed by battering rams of debris, massive logs torn from upstream banks that slammed broadside into the trusses and punched through the siding. 1869 was not the only catastrophe. In 1895, heavy rains hit New England again and destroyed dozens more covered bridges across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. In 1927, the Great Vermont Flood, the worst in recorded state history, took still more. Each flood stripped away bridges that had stood for decades. Each flood left communities severed from the roads and markets on the other side of the river. Towns that could not afford to rebuild lost their crossings permanently. Roads stopped at the water's edge. Farmers could not move their grain or hay. Children walked miles upstream to find a bridge that still held. But some bridges survived every flood, and the survivors teach us what the best builders already knew. The bridges that held through the worst of it shared specific characteristics. They sat higher above normal water level, giving floodwaters room to rise beneath the deck without reaching the structure. Their abutments were wider and deeper, founded on bedrock or dense clay rather than loose gravel. Their trusses had additional lateral bracing, diagonal knee braces that prevented the box from racking sideways under the pressure of fast-moving water. Their roofs had steeper pitches, shedding heavy snow faster and reducing the dead weight pressing down on the structure through the long winters. None of this was written in a manual. No bridge building school taught flood resistance. The builders who got these details right did not learn them in any classroom. They learned them by walking through wreckage. Every covered bridge builder in New England had personally seen a bridge wash away. Every one of them had waded through the debris field downstream and studied what broke first: the joints that pulled apart under stress, the abutments that shifted on their gravel beds, the lattice members that splintered where the pegs had been placed too close to the end of the plank. Failure was the curriculum. The bridges still standing today are the survivors of that education, the final exam passed by wood and stone and the intelligence of anonymous hands. The survivors deserve to have their names spoken aloud. The Cornish-Windsor, 1866, 449 feet, the longest covered bridge in America. The Bridgeport, 1862, 233 feet, the longest single-span covered bridge on Earth. The Roseman Covered Bridge, 1883, Madison County, Iowa, 87 feet of town lattice truss over the Middle River. You may know this bridge from the novel by Robert James Waller or the Clint Eastwood film. But the Roseman was already a treasure before Hollywood noticed it. In the 1970s, a wave of arson targeted covered bridges across the rural Midwest. The fires were set at night, usually between 2 and 4 in the morning, when no one was near and no one would see the smoke until the entire structure was engulfed. A covered bridge full of aged, dry timber burns fast and burns hot. Once the roof catches, the flames race along the inside of the structure like fire inside a chimney. 20 minutes is usually enough to reduce a 100-year-old bridge to charcoal and twisted nails on stone abutments. The Roseman was a target. Everyone in Madison County knew it. A local volunteer decided to do something about it. Night after night, he brought a blanket and a flashlight and sat inside the bridge on the plank deck, alone in the dark, listening to the river below him and the old timbers creaking in the cold above, waiting for anyone who might approach with a match or a can of kerosene. He did this for weeks. He did not get paid. He did not get recognized. The bridge survived because one man decided it was worth losing sleep over. The Heartland Covered Bridge, 1881, Heartland, New Brunswick, Canada. 390 feet long, the longest covered bridge in the world, longer than the Cornish-Windsor by some 59 feet. It spans the St. John River and has endured more than 140 years of maritime winters. Ice jams grinding against the piers with a sound like cracking bones, and spring floods fed by the snowpack of an entire Canadian province. These bridges are still standing because ordinary people refused to let them disappear. Covered bridges require constant, hands-on maintenance. The roof must be reshingled every 20 to 40 years. Siding boards rot and split and must be replaced. Deck planks, worn smooth by a century of traffic, must be pried up and swapped for fresh-cut replacements. Tree nails that have finally loosened after 150 years must be redriven or pulled and replaced. Stone abutments need repointing, the old mortar chiseled out joint by joint, and fresh mortar packed in by hand. None of this happens on its own. In the 20th century, as steel and reinforced concrete became the dominant materials for American bridges, covered bridges lost their economic argument entirely. Highway departments looked at a century-old covered bridge and saw a bottleneck. Too narrow for modern tractor trailers, too low for oversized loads, too labor-intensive to maintain when a flat concrete span could be poured in 3 weeks and ignored for 40 years. Between 1900 and 1970, highway departments across the country demolished thousands of covered bridges. Not because the bridges had failed structurally, not because they were unsafe, because they were inconvenient. Towns that had maintained their covered bridges for 3 and 4 generations stood by while state work crews dismantled them in a single afternoon and replaced them with featureless concrete slabs that could carry more tonnage but carried no memory at all. At peak, around 1860, America had approximately 14,000 covered wooden bridges standing. 14,000. Today, roughly 700 survive. More than 13,000 were lost, some to the great floods, some to fire, arson, or lightning, some to ice jams that crushed the trusses like kindling, some to simple neglect, the roof leaking year after year, the timbers softening, the bridge sagging closed until it collapsed under its own weight. But the majority, the vast majority, were lost to deliberate demolition. Progress demanded wider roads and higher clearances. Convenience demanded structures that required no yearly attention, and the covered bridges were sacrificed to both. The people who saved the 700 that remain were not engineers or government officials. They were locals, volunteers, members of historical societies, many of them retired school teachers and farmers and shopkeepers who remembered crossing the bridge as children and could not bear to watch it torn down. They organized. They showed up at planning meetings and spoke for 3 minutes at the microphone. They wrote letters to state legislators. They collected petition signatures door to door. They argued, sometimes for years, against indifferent bureaucracies, that a covered bridge was not merely a piece of transportation infrastructure that could be replaced by a wider, flatter alternative. It was a record of what their community had once been capable of building with its own hands. In Vermont, in New Hampshire, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Indiana, in Oregon, and in a dozen other states, these small and stubborn groups of citizens fought the demolition orders and won. They secured listings on the National Register of Historic Places. They applied for federal and state restoration grants. They held church suppers and bake sales to raise matching funds. And when the money ran out, they did the maintenance themselves, climbing onto 100-year-old roofs with bundles of cedar shingles, crawling inside the dark trusses with cans of preservative, replacing worn deck planks on Saturday mornings, performing the upkeep that no government budget would cover. The covered bridges that survive today are monuments to human stubbornness as much as they are monuments to structural engineering. They endure because someone cared enough to keep them standing. But we must also sit with the full weight of what was lost. For every bridge saved, 20 were torn down or abandoned. And with each one, a physical record of how Americans once built was erased from the landscape forever. A covered bridge was never merely a way to cross a river. It was also a place. In the 1800s, covered bridges were where young couples met out of sight of their parents, where farmers paused their wagons to let their horses rest in the shade on a hot August afternoon, where children played in the cool darkness on summer days and carved their initials into the siding with pocket knives. There was a reason people called them kissing bridges. The covered bridge was one of the only public structures in a rural town that offered shelter, privacy, and the sound of running water all at the same time. It was part of the infrastructure of daily life in ways that went far beyond transportation. It was a demonstration of what a small community could accomplish, using nothing but local timber, local stone, local labor, and the skills passed from one generation of builders to the next. The wood came from the hills above town, trees that the builders had watched grow their whole lives. The stone came from the fields and ledges beside the road, the same stone that broke plows every spring. The hands that shaped and raised the timbers belonged to neighbors who would cross that bridge every day for the rest of their lives. The master builder who directed the work might have been the same man who framed your barn or built the pews in your church. A covered bridge was a structure made from the very ground it served, by the very people who depended on it. There was a circularity to it that modern construction has completely abandoned. When we demolished those bridges, we broke that ancient connection between craft and place. We replaced something that belonged to its ground with something that could have been poured anywhere on Earth and would look exactly the same. I think often about the men who built these bridges and left behind no record of themselves except the work. Not a Thiel town who got a patent and a footnote in architectural history. Not Theodore Burr, who at least got his name on a truss type. I think about the unnamed carpenters and farmhands who stood on the falsework above a cold river and drilled the peg holes and swung the mallets. Men who arrived at the work site before dawn and did not leave until the light failed. Men who stood in October river water up to their waists, setting foundation stones by hand, leveling each course, building something they fully expected would outlast them. They were correct. But most of them left no diary, no photograph, no headstone with the word carpenter or bridge builder chiseled into the granite. They vanished the way most working people vanish, absorbed back into the soil of the country they built with their labor. The bridges they raised are the only evidence that they ever existed at all, and those bridges are still bearing weight. I have stood inside the Bridgeport covered bridge in California on a winter afternoon when the sun was low and the light came through the gaps in the siding in long, bright bars that fell across the howe truss like the lines of a musical staff. If you look closely at those timbers, you can see the marks of the tools, the shallow, scalloped bites of the broadaxe that squared the round log, the spiral grooves of the hand auger that drilled the bolt holes, the long, smooth planes of the adze that dressed the deck planks flat. Those marks were cut into the wood by specific hands on specific days in 1862. David Wood's crew. Men whose names no archive holds. They were standing right there, in that exact spot, shaping that timber with the tools clenched in their fists, 163 years ago. The timber they shaped is still holding everything up. If you ever have the chance to cross a covered bridge in Vermont or New Hampshire or Pennsylvania or Oregon or Iowa, stop the car. Step out. Walk through the bridge slowly, on foot. Listen to the floorboards groan under your weight, that deep wooden protest that vibrates up through your boots and settles into your knees. Look up at the truss above you, the lattice or the arch, and understand that you are standing inside the handiwork of a man who was born in the 1820s or the 1830s, a man who learned to cut a mortise joint by watching his father, who learned how wood carries weight by building barns before he ever touched a bridge, who stood in cold water and drove tree nails with a mallet and built something he believed would last. He was right. If this story meant something to you and you want to hear more like it, subscribe to this channel. We are not done telling the stories of the people who built America by hand. We are not even close to done. When you drive across the Cornish-Windsor covered bridge today, your tires are rolling over timbers that were sawn from trees felled in the 1860s. Trees that were saplings when George Washington was still alive. The tree nails that hold those timbers together were shaped by calloused hands that have been gone for more than a century, driven home by wooden mallets that were burned for firewood before anyone reading this was born. But the joints are still tight. The lattice still distributes every pound of load exactly the way James Tasker intended it to. The bridge still works. Tasker was 60 years old when he finished that bridge. He had no degree, he had no title, he had no office with his name on the door. What he had was a lifetime of watching wood, understanding how it swells in the rain and shrinks in the dry cold, how it carries weight along the grain and splits across it, how joints loosen when water gets in, and how to build joints that water cannot reach. He put everything he knew into 449 feet of covered bridge, peg by peg, plank by plank, timber by timber. And then he stepped off the deck and went home, and the bridge kept standing behind him. It is still standing. The roof keeps the rain off the trusses. The tree nails keep the joints locked tight. The lattice holds every triangle in shape. And the Connecticut River flows underneath, the same river in the same channel, carrying snowmelt from the White Mountains of New Hampshire down through the valley toward the sea, exactly the way it did in 1866. The men who built these bridges are gone now, every last one of them. Their names are mostly unrecorded. Their faces are mostly unknown. But their work remains, solid, quiet, patient, still bearing the full weight of a country that has largely forgotten who put it there. 700 bridges, built by hand, still standing. That is their legacy. And unlike the bridges themselves, it does not need a roof to protect it.